Dutch Kutschban sang ting viet nay. They didn't just burn libraries. They burned certainty. The comfort of paper, there is something deeply reassuring about a library. The smell of aging paper. The quiet hum of climate control. The weight of leather-bound volumes that seem older than memory itself. We are taught implicitly that the past is safe. That somewhere, in vaults and archives, history rests untouched. That if we ever doubted a narrative, we could simply trace it backward, past the textbooks, past the interpretations, to something original. Ink. Parchment. Proof. But what if that assumption is the most fragile thing in the room? Because the deeper you look into the survival of written knowledge, the more a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. Not absence in one place. Absence everywhere. The window look closely at the timeline between 1650 and 1850. To centuries. 200 years that changed everything. Religious wars reshaped Europe. Monarchies fell. Revolutions ignited. Empires expanded and collapsed. Cities burned not metaphorically, but literally. London, 1666. Copenhagen, 1728. Lisbon, 1755. Moscow, 1812. Washington, 1814. Monasteries dissolved across Europe. Aristocratic estates seized during revolutions. University libraries caught in crossfire. Individually, each catastrophe has a clear explanation. Collectively, they form something harder to dismiss. Because these were not small losses. They were repositories, archives, collections accumulated over centuries. And they disappeared within the same historical window that ushered in what we now call modernity. The silence in the footnotes when historians reference these events, they do so calmly. A fire destroyed the collection. Manuscripts were lost. Records did not survive. The phrasing is clinical. Contained. But pause for a moment. What does it mean for a civilization to lose entire libraries? What does it mean when the only surviving references to ancient knowledge are summaries written after the originals vanished? We accept the loss as unfortunate. But rarely do we confront its implications. Because once you begin tracing what disappeared, the silence becomes louder. Survival is not neutral. We assume that what survives is representative. It isn't. Preservation depends on power, proximity, and probability. Legal documents survive because governments require them. Religious doctrine survives because institutions defend it. Administrative records endure because states depend on continuity. But what about experimental texts? Technical manuals? Alternative cosmologies? Local chronicles that contradicted emerging national myths? Those were often housed in monasteries, guild halls, private collection spaces vulnerable to political upheaval. When those spaces burned, so did the ideas inside them. And history continued without them. The consolidation something changed in the 18th and 19th centuries. Archives were centralized. National libraries were established. Cataloging systems were standardized. Fireproof construction became the architectural norm. Iron shelves replaced wood. Concrete replaced timber. Knowledge was gathered under institutional control. This was progress. But it was also filtration. Because once knowledge is centralized, someone decides what is cataloged, what is printed, what is reprinted, what is translated. Not necessarily with malice, but always with criteria. Criteria shape memory. Memory shapes narrative. The question of verification. Modern scholarship prides itself on authentication. Carbon dating. Paleography. Provenance chains. But many of these methodologies emerged after the Great Losses. Carbon dating determines the age of material, not the precise moment words were written. Handwriting comparison relies on surviving exemplars. Chain of custody documentation was often reconstructed following wars and relocations. This does not prove fabrication. But it does reveal something unsettling. The framework used to validate pre-modern documents matured only after much of the pre-modern archive had vanished. We are verifying fragments with systems built after the fragmentation. That is not deception. It is limitation. But limitation has consequences. The temptation to believe it was random, of course. Cities were flammable. Before modern firefighting infrastructure, a single spark could consume blocks. Before industrial printing, manuscripts were singular, not redundant. Before digitization, loss was permanent. Entropy is a powerful explanation. Yet when losses cluster around periods of upheaval, the mind resists randomness. Because upheaval reorganizes power. And power reorganizes information. Revolutions confiscate church property. Empires seize rival archives. Victors rewrite administrative systems. The destruction may not be coordinated across continents. But within each political transformation, records are vulnerable. And vulnerability has direction. The libraries that didn't burn, there's another detail that rarely enters popular discussion. Some private collections survived. Aristocratic estates passed from generation to generation. Shelves of manuscripts remained intact behind closed doors. Not always accessible. Not always catalogued publicly. But preserved. Why? Because private property sometimes withstands chaos better than public institutions. This is not proof of secrecy. But it raises a structural observation. Public knowledge is vulnerable during regime change. Private inheritance can be insulated. That imbalance shapes what becomes official history. 9. The illusion of completeness today. When you walk through a major archive, you see order. Catalog numbers. Digitized entries. Controlled lighting. It feels comprehensive. But what you are witnessing is the product of survival and selection. Not the entirety of what once existed. There were centuries when preservation was inconsistent, localized, fragile. There were texts copied once and never again. When they burned, no duplicate remained. Imagine the intellectual ecosystem that vanished not because it was suppressed but because it was singular. Singular knowledge is mortal. 10. The dangerous question here is where discomfort begins. If enough original materials are lost, verification becomes difficult. If verification becomes difficult, interpretation gains influence. If interpretation gains influence, narratives solidify. And once narratives solidify, they shape education, identity, and national memory. You do not need to invent history to influence it. You only need gaps. Gaps can be filled. And what fills them often reflects the values of the era doing the filling. 11. The architecture of aftermath. Look at libraries built in the mid-1800s. Massive reading halls. Iron frameworks. Stone vaults. They were designed as fortresses against flame. Societies that lose knowledge respond by fortifying knowledge. But fortification also means consolidation. And consolidation means fewer centers of authority. Before, knowledge was dispersed across monasteries, guild halls, private estates. After, it gathered under national systems. Centralization stabilizes. It also standardizes. 12. What we cannot recover. We often speak of lost ancient technologies, lost sciences, lost philosophies. Perhaps some existed. Perhaps some were exaggerated by later storytellers. The honest answer is, we cannot know fully. Not because someone necessarily hides the truth, but because fire reduces nuance to ash. When a manuscript burns, so does context. When context vanishes, speculation grows. The human mind abhors a vacuum. But absence alone does not confirm grandeur. It confirms fragility. 13. Control versus chaos. It is seductive to imagine coordinated erasure. It is dramatic. It offers a villain. But history often reveals something less theatrical and more sobering. Chaos destroys indiscriminately. Political transitions reorganize records pragmatically. New regimes prioritize new narratives. Old documents become irrelevant. Not always suppressed. Sometimes simply neglected. Neglect is quieter than censorship, but equally final. 14. The real mechanism of influence. If someone wanted to alter historical memory, they would not need to burn every text. They would only need to ensure that future generations rely on edited editions rather than originals. That summaries replace manuscripts. That translations outnumber primary texts. That institutional standards define authenticity. This is not accusation. It is structural reality. The further you move from an event in time, the more intermediaries stand between you and it. Intermediaries shape understanding. 15. The uncomfortable middle ground. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between grand conspiracy and innocent accident. Perhaps losses were chaotic. Perhaps consolidation was pragmatic. Perhaps filtration was unintentional. And yet the result remains the same. We cannot access the full intellectual landscape before the modern era. We access fragments. Fragments curated, preserved, translated, cataloged within systems that emerged after waves of destruction. That does not invalidate history, but it humbles it. 16. Living with partial memory. Every civilization inherits incomplete records. What makes the 1650 to 1850 window striking is its density of upheaval during the transition into industrial modernity. It is a hinge in time. On one side, dispersed, fragile manuscript culture. On the other, centralized, institutional archival systems. The hinge is turbulent, and turbulence erases. 17. The final reflections stand in a modern archive today. Listen to the hum of preservation technology. Look at the redundancy of digital backups. Consider how different this is from 3 centuries ago. We live in an era where loss is no longer assumed. But our past was forged in centuries when it was. Maybe nothing extraordinary was erased. Maybe the world before 1800 was exactly as conventional history describes, just less documented. Or maybe certain perspectives vanished because they lacked the protection of power. Either way, certainty burned. And what replaced it was interpretation. Not necessarily deception, but interpretation. And interpretation, once institutionalized, becomes authority. So the question is not simply what burned. It is this: how much of what we call history is survival and how much is selection? Because once you understand that survival is not neutral, the quiet shelves of any library feel different. Not deceptive. Not necessarily manipulated. But incomplete. And in that incompleteness, there is both vulnerability and possibility. The past is not a vault. It is a filter. And we are living on the other side of it.